That is quite the bookshelf. Is that all for show?
Yeah, it's a piece of cardboard.
Yeah, it's very convincing.
2D. Yeah.
Awesome. Where are you joining from?
I live here in Philadelphia in the Fairmount neighborhood.
Oh,
And
cool.
I'm
Nice.
just in my row house while the thunder masses
I
above the
know there's
city.
I usually don't care whether or not it's raining, but I hope the thunder holds off for us.
Well, if it breaks the heat, I think it'd be worth it.
Yeah,
And
it'll ruin the audio and break the
Jo-
heat.
Joyce was terrified of thunder, so
That's
there's, and yet also includes it in his work,
Yeah,
really at really key moments. So maybe it's kind of fitting.
yeah, that's a good point. I'm thinking all about that. My mind's going crazy with the whole Thursday thing.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Perfect.
Why don't you I'll give you a little interview, whatever, or I'm sorry, overview, little blurb that I can find on Penn's website. But maybe if you could just give me a little bit overview of what you study, what you research, what you teach, or maybe even how you got started in academia, what kind of things you were looking into.
Sure. Uh, my name's Paul Saint-Amour. I'm in the English department at University of Pennsylvania, and I teach 19th century, but mostly 20th century literature these days, and have been working, I'd say, principally in the field of modernist studies for the last 15, 20 years. I focus on the novel, and my work has gone through phases where I've been really interested in the crossroads between law and literature. So I wrote a book about intellectual property and the literary imagination. And a handful of years ago, finished a book about modernism and total war. So sort of large scale global warfare that doesn't recognize limits between civilians and combatants. And how modernist literature of the interwar period is sort of wrestling with the memory of World War I and anticipating an even more intensive conflict. So I think about literature and trauma, literary form, and how to think about the capacity of literary form to bear historical traumas or to anticipate future ones. And these days, I'm thinking more and more about environmental questions, I guess, as a lot of folks are in the humanities and beyond.
Yeah.
Thinking about, past and future violence, and the speed at which violence arrives in respect to the non-human world at the hands of the human world. So there's a thread of time and temporality that runs through a lot of my teaching and my research. And Joyce has been a constant, I would say, in my own reading and studying and writing. It was a course on modern British fiction, which I took as a sophomore in college, that introduced me to Ulysses and to the work of Joyce's contemporaries, and really, I think, was the kind of the hinge moment for me in wanting to pursue literary studies as a vocation. And I've been very fortunate to be able to do that ever since, and to do it with wonderful colleagues and students, and in a field that's very lively.
Awesome. There's so much there. The idea of anticipating conflict, is it cliche to have thought about Yeats? I mean, it sounded almost like you were really close to even referencing Slouching Towards Bethlehem or something like that.
Sure.
Or
Yeah, the second coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a way in which the apocalyptic imagination, even when it's thinking about worldly events, is very much informed by religious narratives and mythological narratives about apocalypse. And so the idea of the second coming of a Messiah, which will bring about the end of history or revelation, I think underpins a lot of ostensibly secular thinking about the second coming of an even worse disaster. So for me, that period of the interwar years is kind of pregnant with that expectation of a kind of second coming, whether or not the people expecting it are Christian in their orientation or Messianic in their orientation. So yeah, Yeats is certainly in there, although I'm much more a reader and teacher of Joyce than I am of Yeats, and so it looks pretty different in Joyce. Joyce is held to have a kind of comic sensibility, and rather than an apocalyptic one, right? And so sometimes to look for those shadings, or to hear those sorts of dreadful reverberations in Joyce, can feel a little bit like brushing his work against the grain. But I think it's very much there. I mean, if you think about the time he lived through and the things that he and his generation witnessed, the comic dimensions of his work, I think you could understand as compensatory for some of the disasters that the world was seeing and undergoing.
Interesting. So the class in which you teach about Joyce, is that just a class on Ulysses, or is that Joyce generally, or is that a even wider, maybe like a modernism class? What does that class look like?
I actually teach Joyce in a couple of different classes. So I have a kind of introductory course on modernism in which we read either a couple of Dubliners stories or just a single episode from Ulysses. And then students who are interested in reading more Joyce can take a course that I co-teach with a local artist, Robert Barry, who's a comics adapter of Ulysses. He's the sort of mastermind behind an online, a digital comics adaptation of Ulysses called Scene. And so we teach together a course on Ulysses in which students read all of Joyce's novel and a lot of criticism, scholarship on the novel, but then they, instead of writing kind of conventional research papers, analytical papers, they work together to do kind of creative critical assignments at the end of the semester, in which they write an apocryphal episode of Ulysses, or develop some multimedia installation, or that somehow thematizes or responds to Ulysses in their own kind of creative way. So it's really important in that class for it to be co-taught by somebody who actually does that work.
Yeah.
And can say, like, here's how I solved the problem of trying to put Circe on the page as a comic book, right?
Yeah.
And can help them think through the sort of aesthetic and practical dimensions of adapting or otherwise creatively responding to Joyce. And then I teach Finnegan's Wake in either an upper division undergraduate seminar or in a graduate seminar, often paired with other experimental works from the latter half of the 20th century, so that we're not just reading Finnegan's Wake, but we're reading work that it influenced, or work that was important for Joyce when he was working on the Wake, or just literary and musical work that is in some kind of dialogue with the Wake, whether directly or implicitly.
Interesting. I did something of a Joyce deep dive, as deep as I could manage on my own, and as I got up to Finnegan's Wake, sort of like world weary after Ulysses, I started reading some of Skeleton Key, and then being a huge Campbell fan, and then I just went to Skin of Our Teeth by Thornton Wilder, as opposed to
Sure.
not that it's a replacement, but I maybe got like a few pages in and then thought, you know what, I'll sit with the ideas for now and maybe not have to say that I read the whole thing. So
Sure.
I admit that I gave up on Finnegan's Wake, but maybe you can, maybe you could change my mind again.
Well, I think with the Wake, as with Ulysses, it's a lot more rewarding to read it with a group of other people, rather than to sit alone, in a single cone of light, reading it on your own. I mean, that works for some people, but it's particularly with the Wake, if you can sit in a room with others, even if it's a virtual room, and put your heads together, and also try to loosen your internal sensor so that you can free associate. The Wake is so much about listening to words on a page and being able to hear a lot of different pronunciations, a lot of different languages colliding in those words. And so it helps if you have people who speak a bunch of different languages or who know unusual vocabularies and can sort of pool their resources. And it's a lot more fun to have that kind of experience of reading as a kind of consensual hallucination.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, when a solo hallucination was a little intimidating.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
What brought you to Ulysses first, Kevin? Under what conditions did you first read it yourself?
That's a great question. I remember, I think I had access a few years ago to a bunch of Campbell lectures through Spotify that I would just listen. Some of them were so dense, they were almost like jawbreakers. You had to just kind of like listen to them over and over and over again. And he did this one, I think, where it was kind of like Joyce and Thomas Mann as it relates to Carl Jung. I mean, there was so much going on. And I listened to it. The more I listened to it, I remember like telling my girlfriend, like, look, I'm going to make a decision that like might affect you, but I think I'm going to do like a James Joyce deep dive. It might be 6 months. It might be all I talk about. It could possibly strain our relationship. I just want to warn you about this. And I think it was probably because those Campbell lectures. And then I got he has like a collection of his lectures on Joyce, and I started with that. Then read Dubliner's Portrait. Those were accessible enough. But there was this one lecture where he talks about sort of the epigraph of a portrait where it's from Metamorphosis. Are you familiar with this little epigraph? Yeah. And it's a line from Daedalus saying, he turned his eyes or something like that to unknown arts. Mm-hmm. And Campbell has this like really poetic interpretation of how that's a clue for Joyce's entire career. And obviously that risks being simplifying, but it was certainly like this little, it was like an inroad for me where if I tried to read those books separately, I'd be like, what the hell's going on? To say nothing of trying to have a through line, even if he was maybe forcing it. And he has this like really cool poetic way of explaining how like, Daedalus sort of flies from Crete to the mainland. Joyce flies, so to speak, from Ireland to the mainland of Europe using his art. And some of that's in the conflict of Portrait. But what's more important for Joyce is that he goes from like this sort of provincial sort of symbols and myths of Roman Catholicism to a more general sort of like mainland mythology. And I mean, if you think about how Catholic Portrait of the Artist is, to then this sort of like dream world mythology of what I've read of Finnegan's Wake. So that was sort of my entry point.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it starts with Campbell, and so that in a way leads to the question of what is it about Campbell that you find so compelling that Campbell is the door through which you walk into lots of different chambers.
Yeah. You mentioned the Skeleton Key. I'm sure there's a lot more that's been written that's important about Finnegan's Wake since then, but where does that sort of stand for you now as far as like guiding people through or having any utility?
Well, the Wake is so challenging and so full of obscurities and illusions that there isn't I think, ever going to be a single volume that will do what the Skeleton Key sort of purports to do in its title, right? A single volume that can unlock the whole thing. But I think that it's still valuable. I mean, Campbell was young when he wrote it, but he had the advantage of priority in the sense that it was one of the first full length, if not the first full length studies of Finnegan's Wake. And so, he, given the breadth of his reading, even as a young man, was equipped to shine light into a lot of corners of the book. And so I think that Skeleton Key, it's also organized in a way that's, I think, quite helpful for first-time readers of the Wake. I think, it's still, I believe, still in print, or has been brought back into print. So that tells you something about its ongoing utility. There isn't a sense that it's been superseded because it was naive or something like that, even though it's, of necessity, an incomplete and partial reading. It's still a valuable one. I think that sometimes there is a kind of tension between Campbell's Jungian commitments, let's say, and Joyce's commitment to Vico, which, operates a little differently. And so I think that, I wouldn't want to be boxed into a Jungian version of Joyce. I think that, that could be flattening, but it can also be illuminating, to a certain extent. And so yeah, Campbell continues to have his place for sure.
Yeah, he has an interesting, and I get the sense that you're onto something there with the an almost dismissive commitment to a Jungian interpretation. But I bet that's true. But a lot of times in his lectures, at least, he seems really interested in what might have been going around. And I know this is sort of a dangerous and almost, this is like, people try to avoid this now, but what might have been going on sort of in the milieu around Joyce, and some of these ideas that were in the air happening at the same time. And I think he points to sort of some of Jung's work in the early 1900s starting to sort of emerge at the same time that he's writing Portrait and then Ulysses. And I think he does the same thing with some Latin translation of the Upanishads that seemingly sneaks into some of Joyce's ideas. I think he really seemed interested in like what sort of like edgy intellectual ideas were floating around that he might have bumped into, which in my mind would become speculative pretty quickly, but it's still interesting.
There's a famous formulation in the Wake that you've probably heard of, which is when we were young and easily Freudened. And it's, I think rightly taken to be a dismissal on Joyce's part of Jung and Freud as the sort of, as faddish figures of his day. But I think that, there's also a way in which he recognized that he was kind of competing with both of them insofar as he was trying to render something about, what he would not have called the unconscious, but I think what we recognize as something like unconscious life and interior life in ways that were maybe adjacent to Freud, if not reducible to Freud. And that he was interested in the commonalities between different cultural mythologies in ways that might put him adjacent to Jung, who had actually written him a fan letter, had written a very positive review of Ulysses, had actually seen Joyce's daughter Lucia at one point as patient. So Jung and Joyce actually intersect a little bit, as sort of people in the world in a way that Joyce and Freud don't quite.
Interesting. Would they also have been correct me if I'm wrong here, would they've been around Zurich Lake at about the same time? Though it's huge.
I don't know enough about Jung's time there. What years was he there? Do you
Don't,
remember?
no, I don't remember.
Yeah, I mean,
Towards the
Joyce is
end.
in Zurich basically from 1915 until the end of the war,
Okay.
thereabouts. And I'm not aware that they moved in overlapping social circles, but um, but but they may have been in some geographical proximity. I'm not sure about that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
These might be frustratingly big questions, but I'm curious how you frame Ulysses specifically in a class where you primarily read that, where that's the primary text. How do you frame that to students? Do you suggest what the goals might be? Maybe what are your public goals, or and what might be your private goals? Um, if if a student forgets your name in 15 years, but takes something out of that class, do you have an idea of what you might want that to be? Um, and I'm curious, maybe comparing our jobs. I don't take for granted that my kids want to read whatever we're reading, and I sort of determined that it's part of my description to be something of a salesman in that regard. Do you find yourself trying to explain, the purpose or the use of reading this book? Because it can be daunting, certainly in certain episodes.
The two parts of your question are in an interesting kind of tension for me, insofar as one of the things that brings people into a class to read Ulysses is its reputation as a difficult book.
Sure.
Right? There is, now that the book is 100 years old, it has been, maybe displaced to some degree by other more recent difficult books. But I think for most of the existence of Ulysses, that reputation has been a kind of challenge that has attracted certain kinds of readers. Some of them who really want to engage deeply with it, others who want to get through it in order to sort of say that they've gotten through it, which is, a perfectly common reason to read a book. And yet, I think one of my very public goals, I'm not sure that I have private goals apart from the public ones when I'm teaching, because it's, for me, really important to just be transparent about, what my goals are and where their edges are too, because I think that classes do need to have, particularly literature classes, need to have a kind of openness with respect to their goals, so that they don't foreclose things that the teacher can't anticipate. But I want to kind of push back a little bit against the ferocious reputation that Ulysses has as a book that lots of people own but nobody reads, because I do think it's very readable.
Huh.
And I mean, it's not like falling off a log. It's we don't want to be naive about the challenges that it can present a reader now 100 years later, or really any reader. But it is also a book that's full of life, that has some very accessible sections and facets, that has very memorable characters, that's full of its sense of place and the sort of historical textures of its setting. It's a very playful book. It's one that I think, it can accommodate a lot of systematized reading, but it doesn't demand it. I think you can read Ulysses with benefit and real interest without knowing anything about Homer's Odyssey, or without knowing much about Catholic theology or Irish history, because there's so much there that even the parts of it that are closed to you because of the limitations of your own knowledge and experience don't exhaust what it has to offer. So I guess I'm happy for people to show up because of that reputation. And then what I want them to do is then to actually set it aside and just interact with the text. And I think that the way that Rob, Barry, and I teach it together as a text for creative people to engage in a kind of creative / critical dialogue with helps people do that, right? That their job is not just to analyze it and somehow master it. It's to engage in a kind of dance with it,
Mm,
right? To choreograph a kind of creative pas de deux with the book, and
interesting.
to approach it as fellow creative writers
Mm,
as well as analytical readers. And so that can sort of de-escalate some of the um, the kind of intellectual stakes, which then for me is is the necessary precondition of its becoming an intellectually engaging book,
yeah,
right? When you're not all kind of
yeah,
tightly wound about whether you're going to get it all.
interesting. I was gonna ask that. Do you how long have you been doing this model with the sort of creative element? And how many years had you been doing, or for how long had you been doing maybe a more traditional model, for lack of a better term?
I mean, I taught Ulysses. I guess the first time I taught it would have been in the very late '90s, and I guess I taught it for 15 years in a more conventional vein, and maybe 20 years, and so it's for something like the last 7 or 8 years that Rob and I have co-taught it in the way that I've described here. Um, and Yeah, I mean, I can also imagine going back to teaching it in a more conventional literary studies way. There are benefits to both approaches, um, but I think you know that we've had such successes in our class with students getting to know Ulysses in a kind of intimate way because they're responsible to it as fellow creative writers. Going back and rereading parts of it so that they can um, produce a screenplay adaptation that adds new material to what's there, but has to really get the details correct.
Sure.
Or because they're doing a side-scrolling platform video game based on it, and so they want to figure out what parts of what dialogue and what aspects of the environment are going to translate best into that medium. So I guess as a teacher, I'm very interested in encouraging people to reread, not just to read something once in order to then have a conversation about it, but to go back to passages and really get to know them intimately um, and closely. And a great way to do that again is to take them back as both analysts and creatives to the
Yeah,
material.
there's something so interesting about that agency and ownership that almost lends itself to a depth of analysis that sometimes is sort of seems off limits, right?
Mhm.
Or at least, off limits to, yeah, there's something really interesting that happens. So it's like you're now responsible for creating something in relation to this text or in relation to this thing that seems to invite a depth and the sense of ownership
Right.
where, at least in my experience, the kids will like reread something and I'm like, wow, they're really they're really taking this personally. Is there something that you, in designing the class, that you start to lose? Like, do you necessarily, just for the sake of time, have to sacrifice some of the historical contextualization? How do you make those decisions?
Um, if you had a whole year in which to teach Ulysses, you could, of course, go more deeply into every aspect of it, right? You could go more deeply into, as you're saying, the historical context, into theology, mythology, into the map of Dublin, excuse me, in 1904, into the publication history of the book and all of the pre-publication materials and drafts and note cards and everything. There's a whole wing of Joyce studies, which is called genetic criticism, which is about the genesis of the text, and it studies the stages of its composition and revision. So in our class we touch down a little bit into each of those things, in addition to, feminist criticism and gender criticism and critical race theory as it pertains to Joyce's project, and on and on. But a class that exhaustive could also be kind of exhausting if you're subjecting this one textual object to all of these sort of different optics. And I think it actually works better to take students through it, to give them a kind of sampling of ways of approaching it, but not to overwhelm them with the wealth of, essentially 100 years worth of scholarship on this book. And then encourage them to go back to pick those tools up again as suits their own creative and critical projects. I think in a standard analytical class where you're going to write a research paper, sometimes with a very canonical book like Ulysses, or canonical writer like Joyce or Shakespeare, or any of the writers who've been sort of thoroughly read and studied for many years, there can be a sense that so much scholarship has been published on these writers that if you're a 19 or 20-year-old reading them for the first time, what could you possibly have to add? And of course, I think, any good teacher would say you have an infinite possibility. There's an infinite possibility of new ways for you to approach the work, or to bring your own experience to it, or your own historical moment to bear on it. But I do think it can be intimidating to deal not only with the wealth of the text itself, but the wealth of its critical heritage. And so another thing that I like about this kind of creative critical approach is that there is a little bit less that sense of like the weight or burden of the scholarship being the thing that you have to kind of wrestle with, because you're also trying to breathe a new kind of creative life into the work or its legacy. And that can include pushing back against it creatively and critically. So some of the student projects that Rob and I have seen come out of this class are really wrestling with aspects of Joyce's book that haven't aged so well, or that seem to be very much a sort of function of his subject position or his historical moment. And it gives students an opportunity to kind of write back in respect to the text without simply stating in a kind of bald-faced way, this isn't how we should think anymore, right? You can administer a kind of corrective gesture to something that you think hasn't, kind of kept up with the norms of the day, in a more subtle and I think positive way when you're writing a kind of creative and critical response to it. That would be my instinct, I think, based on the years of teaching this class.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love that approach. It's really impressive. I want to go back to the context of this being read in sort of a modernist class, or a class on modernism. You said earlier something along the lines of, there can be a flattening effect to a singular lens when applied to this book. Is there maybe this isn't the right way to ask this question, but is there a risk of saying, well, okay, we're going to read this in a modernism class, and we're going to look at all the ways this is a modern text and how it plays with the form? Is something lost there? I get the sense, I remember I talked to somebody somebody's like, oh, if you're reading Ulysses, you have to talk to this person. And all I wanted to talk about were like the themes and the Thor's Day and, the clap and all this. And it was like, I got this conversational lecture about the publication history. And I thought, oh, isn't that interesting? He's taken a few classes on Joyce, and this is what he's, it doesn't really sound like he's in love with the text anymore. Just that there's this like, look what I know about it. Does teaching it in a modernism class, does it run that risk of becoming a little too academic, where this sort of creative lens lends itself to a more some sort of depth?
I mean, I guess I would say that it's a risk of any class, sort of irrespective of modernism. I don't think the problem you're describing is a modernism problem.
Certainly not.
I think it's a pedagogical problem,
Interesting.
and it's not altogether soluble in the sense that, no two people are going to come to a text with the same interests or enthusiasms or orientations. And so sometimes other people's take on something that you're deeply invested in or curious about can be frustrating just because it's not yours.
Sure.
Right. I would say, that the modernist frame around Ulysses is certainly not just about its publication history, right? I mean, there's so much to say about modernism as in some ways anti-academic, right? As trying to kind of explode some of the conventions and received wisdoms of the literary traditions that modernist writers were, partly coming out of, but partly trying to wrestle into new shapes or to just leave behind altogether. So I think that there's a kind of insurrectionary spirit in a lot of modernist work, which can be very exciting and can really revitalize a literary studies classroom. But of course, modernism, as we know better with each year, wasn't just one thing. And, the modernism that, let's say, I was, educated in my teens and 20s isn't the modernism that people are learning about nowadays. I mean, we have a much more flexible and populous sense of what modernism was, what it is. It's a much more contested term. It's not just sort of Ezra Pound and the men of 1914. So I think modernist studies as a field has gone in really exciting directions, and partly, by dint of having, shifted its focus away from the giant figures like Joyce and Eliot and Pound, and looked at their less well-known contemporaries or at writers who are writing in other parts of the world in relation to their work, sometimes in later periods, sometimes in earlier periods, or alongside them. So yeah, I mean, it's a long answer to your question, but I think that modernism doesn't in any way have to be a kind of flattening or life-sucking frame to put around Ulysses or any work. It's a very interrogative frame. It's a term which is very up for grabs. I mean, people in the field really don't agree about what modernism was and whether it's over even, right? I mean, there's a kind of fight going on now about whether we're still in a period where modernism is being practiced. Is any kind of experimental or form-breaking work still modernist? Or, do we lose something when we refuse to sort of periodize modernism? Is there something really useful about saying it ended around a certain time and whatever came after needs to have a different name because it is in some ways building on modernism rather than being inside the belly of that whale? So yeah, modernism is it's a term that generates, I think, a lot of sparks and a lot of questions these days, rather than, or rather it should do, rather than a lot of sort of prefabricated and deadening received narratives about a work.
Interesting.
I may have just given you a very pedantic answer, though.
No, there's a lot of strings to pull, and I'm not sure which one. That was a good answer.
Yeah.
I'm interested in this idea of modernism being sort of subversive, and Joyce at least in my reading, seems like very overtly subversive. I mean, immediately, even with like the title, um, where he's sort of like, this is a clear allusion to a classic, right? That I'm now going to sort of flip on its head.
Mhm.
Um, was that in immediate? Was that in immediate response to something where people? Um, was he resisting anything that would have been sort of in, I don't know, if not Dublin, then sort of like the literary world of the time that would have sort of directed his attention towards the Odyssey in the first place to play with? Or was he just tinkering um, with old forms or maybe classics in general?
Well, I mean, we can speculate, which I think is very useful to do, but often I think scholars begin with what Joyce said about his reasons for choosing the Odyssey, and specifically for choosing Odysseus as the sort of central figure of this work. And, I think for him, Hamlet is too much of a son figure, right? He's too much in the sun. He's too sort of stuck in the filial role. And a lot of other candidate heroes were also sort of too tethered to a single kind of aspect of human experience, whereas for him Odysseus was, a statesman, a warrior, a strategist, a lover, a husband, a father, a son. He was a kind of all-around figure, and also one who I think was, for that reason, more kind of exportable to a later historical moment, right? Because, I think when we walk through our days, we walk through many roles, right? And we understand ourselves in a more kind of performative and multifaceted way. And so there was something about that story and about that figure that I think seemed really adaptable to a kind of contemporary moment. Um, one could speculate that there's something about the kind of canonical status about Homer's Odyssey that was kind of a tempting thing to attack or to compete with. But I don't know. I think it's more a gesture of affection and attachment to Homer than it is a a, a kind of project organized around dislodging or unseating Homer. Even though it's Ulysses is also wrestling with Homer, right? I mean, it's not just a kind of genuflection to Homer by any means. And this is one of the ongoing debates about Ulysses. Does it use the mythical substrate, as T.S. Eliot claimed, to kind of impose order on what Eliot described as the immense panorama of futility and anarchy that is modern history? Or
which reminds me of a line, doesn't where I think it's from Portrait, where he says, history is a nightmare or something like that.
from which I'm trying to awake.
Yeah. And there was another reference that reminded me of a line where you said, we walk through many. There's that all in all of us line.
Right. That's in the library scene in Ulysses.
And he's talking, around Hamlet as well. Interesting.
Right. Yeah. And about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare had many facets as well, and put himself in many of his characters.
Put himself, I think.
But just to complete that thought, so Eliot, sees Homer as imposing order on 1904. But I think a lot of readers, maybe most readers these days, don't think that the power is only flowing in one direction. In other words, that order comes from myth and it organizes contemporaneity. There are things that 1904 does for the ancient Greek world in response. And there's a lot of playfulness that happens when those two layers intersect. And it's not at all clear which one of them has more authority, or whether it's even a question of authority ultimately that's happening in the kind of interaction between those layers in Ulysses.
Yeah, interesting. That's a really cool question. Yeah, in some ways there are these archetypes, not to run around with a Jungian hammer, but then there are sort of these the folk masks of those archetypes, where Circe's no longer a goddess on an island, she's in a brothel. Interesting.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things Ulysses does by taking these gods and heroes down a few pegs, right, is, you could argue, is to kind of democratize um, or you know, deauthorize mythology and canonicity, history, right? Bring the gods and heroes down to the level of the everyday. Even as the sort of relationship between Odysseus and Leopold Bloom, Joyce's protagonist, also endows Bloom with certain kinds of heroic qualities, right? So again, the kind of authority and influence are traveling in lots of different directions.
Interesting. I want to go back to this idea that Joyce himself said something like Hamlet was too neat, or I forget what your word was, too filial, right?
Yeah, I think I'm paraphrasing, but I think that was the gist of it.
And yet you do have this sort of Telemachus, Odysseus. People love to say for the Odyssey and maybe for Ulysses that it's a father looking for a son.
Mm-hmm.
My sense is that it can't possibly be that neat. Do you, when you're framing your class, is it clear that the story should be more about Bloom or more about Stephen? I mean, what do you do? I know obviously that a larger portion of the book is dedicated to Bloom. How do you make out their relationship, or how do you invite students to start to wrestle with what their relationship might be, or if that isn't too sloppy of a question?
No, it's a tough one, because I think particularly if you're a 19 or 20-year-old reader encountering this book for the first time, Stephen is in his early 20s,
Yeah.
and is a bookish fellow, and it's very tempting to identify with him. And if you've read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, you've already met him, and you've come to think of him as Joyce's kind of surrogate. And then to have Ulysses pivot away from him in the fourth episode, and to kind of turn him into an intermittent character, who more and more is sort of in Bloom's shadow, at least until they rejoin and kind of become that it kind of becomes a bromance of sorts in some of the final episodes. It can be disorienting, it's as if the writer has had a kind of change of heart. And I think that's one way that students interpret it, right? That Joyce is writing Ulysses in his 30s. It's published on his 40th birthday, and has begun to lose some interest in Stephen, insofar as a 22-year-old is wrestling with a different life stage and different issues than a husband and father in his 30s. And yet I think it's a mistake to just jettison Stephen, right? And to say, well, he's sort of, Joyce is done with him. Because I think that's not right. And he does resurface repeatedly after Calypso, which is the first episode where we turn to Bloom. So Stephen is still very much in play, and the relationship between those two characters, really is the core of the novel, even though it's a relationship that is kind of oblique. We don't know what its future is. In what we think is going to be the kind of great homecoming episode, Ithaca, where in Homer, Odysseus and Telemachus are reunited, and they wreak revenge on the suitors, and they take back their home, and they are restored to Penelope as a family. Bloom has Stephen home, and Stephen sings an anti-Semitic song to this older man who identifies, at least sometimes and in some situations, as Jewish. Bloom, I think, quite spectacularly forgives him and offers to put him up for the night. Stephen declines the invitation. Bloom says, well, if you don't want to stay over tonight, why don't you come back and teach my wife proper Italian pronunciation, since she's a singer, and you and I could talk about ideas, and I could introduce you to my daughter. And so, there is the possibility of a relationship continuing, but I think the likelihood is that it will not, because these two people are really different, and a kind of crack has formed in this new relationship as a result of what Stephen has done. So it is kind of a melancholy reunion, and it's a very short-lived one with an uncertain future. But I think if we don't care about Stephen, then we don't really feel the potential and also the likely loss of a potential intimacy there. So Stephen can't just be a kind of finger puppet, callow young man. He is a traumatized figure, who's like wrestling with his guilt at not having prayed at his mother's deathbed, and sees her ghost, on this day, and is trying to ward it off. So he's fascinating, I think.
Interesting. This might be where I start to lose you, so excuse the ignorance of these speculations, but are there, I think I read this collection of essays by René Girard on Shakespeare, and he has in there this really cool essay about Stephen's speech or lecture at the library. And there's a line in there in his lecture, Stephen's lecture, that interests me. I think it interests Girard, but I think I ran away with it a little bit at the end, where he kind of plays with this Hamlet idea, and about Shakespeare sort of being all of his characters in some way, or all of his characters being part of him in some way, where maybe he didn't think these things or say these things or experience these things, but he heard a story where he did, and then suddenly it's in the play. And there's a line where it's something like the boy in Act 1 is the mature man in Act 5, or replace those numbers. But I think it's a reference to Hamlet, but I kind of got fixed on it with this idea that Bloom's name, obviously he's blooming, and short of resisting this temptation to jettison Stephen, there is this feeling sometimes where it's like the boyishness of Stephen needs to die to something greater, or at least yield to something greater. And when I think about your synopsis of that homecoming scene, where in the Odyssey they sort of destroy the suitors together, in Ulysses, when he goes to destroy the suitors, which in my interpretation are sort of like Bloom's thoughts of I don't know, being haunted by Molly's infidelity, or his own moments and sort of his failures, he sort of slays them on his own, right? Those demons or suitors, whatever you want to call them. Is there a part where the boy has yielded to the man, and now Bloom is sort of on his own? So in the Odyssey they're together, but in Ulysses they're sort of one. Is that way too far? When I think,
Yeah.
sorry, I think about the climax being like this moment of connection and compassionate sort of dissolution of um, separateness, right? Where suddenly he's worried about Stephen's fears. And Stephen's pretty disturbed by the thunder, but he's really disturbed by Bloom's concern for him. I don't know if that's the climax in your reading, but from there on out, it seems like suddenly there is more. There's a primacy granted to that symbolic union.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I like the way, and I like the fact that you and I approach Ithaca differently. And it's one of the, for me, really generative things about the way Joyce uses the Homeric parallel in Ulysses, that it's not a kind of a one-to-one correspondence, right?
Right.
So you were characterizing the suitors, the kind of equivalent of the suitors in Ulysses as Bloom's own fears or anxieties about Molly's infidelities, the many men that have, ogled her or flirted with her. And I think that that's a very plausible way to think about the suitors, right? That they are, that Ulysses sort of psychologizes them. Instead of there being actual people who have usurped the home, they are these sort of phantoms in Bloom's own mind, who are creating a kind of distance between him and his wife, or a crisis in their marriage, which is also being precipitated by the fact that she is in fact taken a lover for the first time on this day. I think there's another way to approach Ithaca and to think about the things that are usurping home as not just the obstacles in Bloom's marriage or those infidelities, or the sort of psychological phantoms that bedevil him, but sort of all obstacles to human intimacy, in a broader sense. So not just in the context of a marriage, but the things that divide him from Stephen, for instance, right? The fact that Stephen, although he is a guest in Bloom's home, does this kind of unprovoked and quite aggressive thing of singing this song, which provokes, prompts really mixed feelings in Bloom. In the Odyssey, the suitors, because they're just they're bad people, can just be killed, right? There's a very cathartic scene of mass violence. It's an incredibly graphic and bloody scene of just slaughter, right? Completely unmitigated slaughter. And what Joyce does by making Ithaca the quietest episode in Ulysses, right, is to ask the question of where is the violence and where is the catharsis happening in this episode, right, which consists of a middle-aged, middle-class man bringing, an acquaintance home, taking a little care of him, and then sending him on his way, right? And I think the question of where the violence is and where the usurpation is, and whether slaughter occurs or whether something else happens, right? Is this an Ithaca that's more about forgiveness being the thing that makes home safe than revenge being the thing that makes home safe? All of those questions for me make this book rewarding to teach, right? Because it's not a paint by numbers set of correspondences. So just to come back briefly to your question about whether in some ways Stephen has been superseded by Bloom, I think it's Stephen's presence in Bloom's home that makes Bloom vulnerable and also makes him generous, gives him an opportunity to say in response to somebody who is just drunk, engaged in a kind of drunken act of aggression toward him, I forgive you, I invite you, even if you decline my invitation, I'll look for another way to continue our association, because I see you as someone in need whom I can help, and also as someone who might bring welcome things into my life. So again, I don't think that there's a kind of handing of the baton from Stephen the son to Bloom the father. I really do think it's, it is, if we think about both Bloom and Stephen as having aspects of Joyce, right? You could think of it as a kind of time travel novel in which, the past version of yourself is able to meet and encounter and offend and also inspire the present version of yourself, and gives you an opportunity to realize that we're not self-identical, right? We don't correspond with ourselves at different moments in our lives. That those differences of role really are significant ones, even as we're detectably the same person throughout the thread of a life.
Fascinating. What do you do with the biographical sort of snippets that might be interesting to consider in a thematic interpretation of the book? For example, you said that just now that, and I agree, there are elements of Joyce in both characters, or at least that's what I assume.
Yeah.
And yet, is it true? I forget where I heard this or read this, that Joyce himself may have actually fallen out of a brothel and have been picked up by and sort of dusted off and maybe even protected from, I forget, the royal guards or whoever, by a middle-aged Jewish man in Dublin. Is that true?
I mean, the facts of the case are pretty shadowy, but
Yeah, well,
Joyce,
considering he was falling out of a brothel to begin with.
Ulysses had its origin as a possible Dubliner story. So he was thinking about it, I think, as early as 1907. And it seems to have had its origin autobiographically in the fact that, as you say, a Dubliner named Alfred Hunter may have taken Joyce in and or protected him from, the accounts vary. Was it the cops? Was it someone with whom, a drunk person who wanted to get into fisticuffs with Joyce? Anyway, this older man did him a kindness. And Joyce, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, believed Hunter to have been Jewish, but in fact he was not. So that Jewishness was a kind of like discursive one. But there is a sense that Joyce remembered the kindness of this older man to him as a young person at a moment of, kind of poor judgment and trouble in his own life. A time when a stranger basically like looked out for him and sort of plucked him up and dusted him off and sent him on his way. And I do think that Ulysses, even though it changed, from a short story in Joyce's conception to this kind of modern epic, right, does have that kind of core of wanting to acknowledge and memorialize an act of hospitality and generosity, on the part of this older man to a younger man who's a kind of avatar of the self of the writer. And I've been referring to this anti-Semitic song that Stephen sings to Joyce. It's interesting that the one place where we see Joyce's handwriting in Ulysses is where we encounter the lyrics to that song, which are written out in Joyce's hand with musical notation too. And, I don't think this is something one could prove, but it does seem significant to me that the author's handwriting is there on the page at a moment when a kind of young version of himself is committing this sort of egregious violation of hospitality. And it does suggest to me, again, I can't prove it, that Joyce is kind of acknowledging having done something like this to somebody who was doing him a kindness, and wanting to acknowledge both that he did it and that the response to it was a generous one. And so for me, that Ithaca episode really is the kind of affective core of the book, because it is so much about hospitality, right? Stephen and Bloom are referred to as the guest and the host respectively, as if those roles were like almost like pronouns. And so they're constructed in this relation of hospitality, which, as we know, is, you know, one of the cardinal virtues isn't quite the right word, but a kind of mandates or requirements, xenia, hospitality towards strangers in the ancient world. And, you know, the question of like, what does hospitality even mean in an occupied colonial city, right, is a very thorny one. And yet here it is in this episode, you know, hospitality from one person to another, an older man to a younger man, in certain ways, an older version of the self to a younger version of the self, a Jew to a Christian. It's an incredibly complex and, to me, very moving scene, which is not about reoccupying the home and reestablishing your sovereignty over it. It's about being willing to risk being unhoused in your own home, right? Being willing to risk losing everything because you have offered hospitality to someone you don't know very well. And somebody who repays you pretty ill, as Stephen does to Bloom. But, you know, again, like that scene lasts in a way that for me, it would not if they had just kind of come together and sealed their bromance with an agreement to, I don't know, have a drink every Thursday down the pub. You know, the kind of fragility of their understanding and the cracks that are already showing in it, the fact that it may already be violated and maybe over, is the thing that moves me about it.
Yeah, interesting. Fascinating. Out of respect for your time, I have two seemingly very disparate questions.
Sure.
Not that any of them have really been perfectly congruent. So do you have a favorite image, and at the risk of leading you, or a sort of favorite image as metaphor, or favorite metaphor that, like, when you read or you reteach, you're like, wow, like it fascinates you every time? Maybe to give you an example, there's like a scene where he reaches for a leaflet and he thinks it says his name, but then it's sort of like the body of Christ or blood of Christ or something, and he kind of
blood of the lamb.
Blood of the lamb.
Is that it? Yeah.
And then the seagulls like dip for it, because I think, and then they immediately sort of like pull away, and he sort of thinks, oh, isn't that funny? Like if I throw a piece of bread, they crash right after it, but they know there's no substance there. And there's like something like this really frustrated Catholic in Joyce, where he seemingly he doesn't want to push it too far away, but he's always just sort of holding it and shaking it. Or at least shaking the way it manifests itself in Dublin around him. That, and I love the sort of like that older woman who, maybe the milk lady or the butter lady, the milk lady,
the milk woman, yeah, and
yeah, and she's sort of like, there's like this wasteland thing going on there. That's fascinating to me, and I don't know enough about Irish history to really appreciate it, but I'm wondering if there are similar metaphors that you find yourself every time, like wishing maybe you had more time in class to talk about, for example.
Wow, it's hard to pick a favorite, but I think just because we've been talking about the Ithaca episode, which is the penultimate episode in the book, you know, I'm put in mind of one of the most famous lines in that episode, and it stands out from the episode because it's a moment of kind of rare lyricism in an episode that is very clinical in its language. You know, Joyce wrote it in what he called a kind of catechetical style, right? In a question and answer style,
yeah,
with a lot of scientific vocabulary, lots of numbers and calculations, and if you're lost if you don't have a good dictionary with you. But Stephen and Bloom, after the scene that I've been talking about where Stephen sings the ballad of Harry Hughes, and declines Bloom's offer of invitation, they go out into the backyard of Bloom's house to urinate, and then to bid farewell. And as they're standing there peeing, they look up into the night sky, and what they see is a heaven tree of stars hung with humid night blue fruit.
Mm.
And that line just on its own is has all sorts of euphony. It's a beautiful line, but when you encounter it in this kind of clinical field of language, and there's just this one moment of a kind of juicy lyricism and figurative language, it feels like a kind of gift, or almost like a manifestation of grace. And you do get the sense that for all of the loss that both of these characters have suffered, right? Bloom having lost a son in infancy, fearing that his marriage is on the rocks and may not survive. His daughter has kind of grown up and is leaving his sphere of influence. Stephen having lost his mother, being in this kind of free fall, not having really found his way with his writing or his teaching. That even the brief connection that they enjoy that evening, right, which may not have a sequel, is a kind of moment of grace, and that one of the shapes it takes is this sentence, that can somehow capture a moment of unlooked for lyricism, generosity. It's a kind of a windfall moment for a reader, right? When you're struggling along with all of this vocab, and then suddenly there's that radiant sentence. And Joyce has a way of rewarding readers, in moments like the ones that you were just mentioning, of moments that are sometimes lyrical, sometimes they're just so well observed, right? Bloom observing that seagulls know the difference between a scrap of paper and a cake. They're just so right, and so they give us a portrait of a world that we recognize, right? And that I think it's one of the things I was talking earlier about, accessible aspects of this book, and I think that his capacity to observe a physical world and a social world and show that world to us in ways that we recognize too, so that we realize we're living in the same world that Joyce lived in, albeit 100 years later. Those moments of connection are what keep me going when I'm struggling with other parts of the book. And I think it's true for first-time readers as well. Was it true for you?
Yeah,
what kept you going?
There were certainly these payoffs. I benefited from having sort of a thematic guide with Campbell, but then, the themes were enough. Like, honestly, I was sort of like, I was surprised by, of course, a book half its size isn't going to encapsulate everything, but I sort of went into it naively thinking, this is going to be 10,000 feet and I've got a snapshot of it, and it's going to be about these themes sort of developing through. And then suddenly, like these, you're right, like these little turns of phrases, they feel like little like rewards or payoffs, especially when you're sort of like dragging through certain parts of it. But then other parts are like sort of like they just keep you interestingly occupied. Like I felt in the Circe chapter, the idea that it turned into a play became very interesting for me, and there was just so much to chew on's not the right word. It almost felt like things were like pinging off of me at like this really bizarre, for lack of a better word, almost like an appropriate rate, where sometimes I felt stretched and then bang, I got this reward or payoff, and then other times it's like it feels like this little tennis match. You're like, okay, this is and you're right. There are moments where I felt like he's really, really descriptive, and there's other moments where I'm like, how did he's not saying much though. Like somehow he's being very descriptive with not a lot of description. And I think of maybe like the first couple chapters, maybe even the first, where it has Stephen and his two other roommates, Buck Mulligan, and I forget the other guy's name.
Haynes.
Yeah, and they're sort of like they're sort of like this bachelor slash college dorm banter, and they're sort of like also a little heady and playing with these like cool ideas and like doing different like Latin versions of masses. I don't know, it was very intricate. And I never felt punished for like trying to look into something, or I never felt like it was ever at my expense. Even like the Oxen of the Sun chapter where I'm like I turn the page, I'm like, oh, what the hell? I guess I gotta look this up. When I did look it up, I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. It's like a history of, obviously this isn't the whole thing, but even if it were just a history of the English language, sort of dragged all the way back, that itself would be cool. But then that it also has like a thematic overlay about, procreation or regeneration. I don't know. It's fascinating.
I agree. I mean, I there are writers who are difficult for the sake of, subordinating a reader, making you kind of pledge fealty and there may be some of that in Ulysses. I mean, it's a book that's interested in S&M, especially in the Circe episode, and you could venture that the relationship between the reader and the text sometimes is a kind of SM relationship, right? But I think for the most part, this is a book that, it's a book whose difficulty is in the service of something other than just difficulty or genuflection to a great writer. There's always a point to the opacity of this book, or to the kind of stunt pilotry or experiments at the level of form. They're not just kind of empty exercises. You don't feel that your time is being wasted. You're being asked to go on a really strenuous walk, but there's always a vista. There's always something to see when you get to the summit. It may be partly enshrouded in fog, but it's there, and you glimpse enough of it to think, I'm glad I did this.
Yeah, and you made me think that there are these images where they're sometimes, even if they were just the images, they would be cool enough, them sort of sitting up in the tower, sort of spitting their seeds. But then, there's been 100 years of analysis. Some of that starts to lend itself really beautifully. It's like, okay, cool, there's this awesome image, but then there's also a few really cool ways to think about it. And if he were thinking one or any of them, that would be cool enough, where it's not just a really cool scene.
Yeah.
Interesting. Maybe to close out, there's, at the risk of contradicting myself, while there are payoffs, there's a lot of ambiguity. And I think I heard famously that Joyce said something along the lines of like, people will be mulling this over for hundreds of years or something.
I think the line is something to the effect of, I've put enough puzzles into it to keep the college professors busy for the next 100 years.
That's even better. Does part of you resent that? 100 years later, being a college professor?
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's obviously a provocation, that line. It's both a provocation to, stick around and try to solve those puzzles, but also it is a bit of a kind of thumbing of the nose at the institutionalization of literature. and of readers who think that a book is a puzzle that's soluble, you know. So, I mean, I think that line, I think it's very funny.
Yeah.
It's also pretty canny in the sense that, Joyce, I think, realized that Ulysses was not going to be important because it would be a bestseller, you know. It was going to be important because it would, its afterlife would be in institutions. He was, I think, a very shrewd thinker about ways that literature can survive. And the Academy sometimes gets described as a kind of life support system for difficult books that are not popular, but that can be kind of kept alive culturally with the life support system of scholarship and the classroom. And I think it's okay for some work to survive under those auspices. And I don't know many Joyceans who approach Ulysses as a puzzle to be solved. I think they think of it as a kind of environment to be explored. And, once in a while, someone solves a puzzle and can say, oh, we figured out this obscure illusion, or, here's something no one has ever seen before that's going on, at the level of form. But for me, it's much less about the kind of binary of, encrypted, decrypted, or, scrambled, solved, than it is about kind of inviting us again into a space that is difficult and self-contradictory and ambivalent and ambiguous enough to engage us for a long time at different stages of our lives as readers, right? You and I were talking earlier about Stephen and Bloom being different ages and maybe being a kind of, an encounter between a younger and an older version of the same person. But if you read this book more than once, you read it at different life stages necessarily. And if you're someone like me who first read it at age 19 and is still reading it in your 50s, then you have, you've never read the same book twice, in part because you're a different reader each time you open it, and you bring different preoccupations and desires and attachments and revulsions and all the rest to each reading. And I think the more complex a text is, the more it can accommodate readers in those different sorts of states. And so I think people who come back to this book come back to it in part because it can meet our complexity with its own, and give us a kind of image of, the unfathomable thing that it is to lead a human life and to be a human subject, in a changing world, in a changing body, and all the rest.
That was a beautiful way to end, but I can't help myself. I have to ask about the Macintosh guy. I referenced the puzzle quote because I'm interested in all these like ambiguous things. Do you have a theory? First of all, do you have a theory that you think is that most people would disagree with you about any of the certain puzzles? Or if you don't want to go there, do you have a theory about the Macintosh guy? I couldn't really get a sense of what he was doing with that guy at that funeral, and then I think he pops up later.
Yeah. So yeah, the man in the Macintosh is this kind of famous enigma in the book, and we never learn his real name, right? But there's a newspaper reporter at this funeral who asks Bloom, do you know the name of the man in and Bloom says Macintosh, and the reporter says, oh, that's his name. And so the man's coat, is the thing that gets misrecognized for his identity. And sure enough, he shows up in the newspaper report as Macintosh. And so to me, it's a joke partly about how how error-filled archives are, right? And how a tiny little accident like that can lead to historical errors about who was present where. So I think partly Joyce is just having fun with that little pun, or that little moment of misrecognition. But I think in some ways, like the having a character in a novel that is otherwise obsessed with identity, right? And is we know Joyce wrote it with a copy of the sort of who's who in Dublin, the Tom's Guide to Dublin, in the year in which the novel is set, 1904. So he was really interested in naming actual people and putting them in their correct addresses and their correct jobs. And yet here's this one figure who's kind of under specified. And I think it has led people to speculate, is it Joyce himself? Is it Hamlet? Is it the ghost of Shakespeare? Is it some other character from Joyce's work? Is it Mr. James Duffy from A Painful Case, which is one of the short stories in Dubliners, which I think is a pretty plausible theory, actually. But I think he's most compelling if he stays an enigma, because he teaches us something about fictionality and about the limits of fictionality to sort of specify and constrain human identity. So I think he's an interesting exception, and chilling because he's an exception, right? I mean, there's something ghostly about him because he doesn't have a fixed address or a fixed identity. He could sort of be a figure for the reader, a kind of man out of time. And I hope that puzzle never gets solved, because it gives me the chills as an unsolved puzzle, or as a kind of area of, again, under specificity. I hope he remains that way.
Maybe next time I could get you to answer your controversial theory. But until then, just some logistics. I'll sort of mix this on Audacity, and then it's easiest to send through Spotify. I have like 8 family members who are really generous and listen to this. Other than that, not too many people are going to see it. So I'll send it to you through Spotify, and then if for whatever reason you want me to pull it or take it down or change something, let me know and I'll do that right away. And then once I hear from you, then I'll push it out a little wider.
Okay.
Awesome.
Great.
Well, Paul, thank you so much. This was awesome.
Yeah, it's been fun talking to you, Kevin. And I'm glad I got to learn a little bit about your interest in Campbell and how Campbell led you to Joyce. And once you send me the link to the podcast itself, I'll be able to go and listen to some of your other episodes too.
Cool.
So that'll be
awesome.
That'll be great for me.
Yeah. And as always, if there's anybody that you're ever talking to, any colleagues or anything that you think I might be interested in talking to, I can't help myself from asking questions. So please send their names along.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Have a nice night.
Yeah, have a good night too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.